Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's SCM Connections web seminar, considering shelf life while planning supply in SAP APO. I am Megan. I'm going to be the facilitator for today's event, and I am the Director of Resources at SCM Connections. If you have any questions, technical difficulties, or anything like that throughout the session, if you could send me those questions through the chat box, that would be great. We'll also be taking questions at the end, so if you can hold questions, that would be good as well. And we will be taking those through the Q&A box that's on your screen. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to be getting into today. Sanjay will be giving us an overview of the webinar. He'll be presenting on our shelf life planning in S&P, and then Patrick Green will be joining us for shelf life planning in PPDS. As you may already know, SCM Connections is a supply chain planning consulting firm. We specialize in advanced planning and optimization. Our consultants are experienced supply chain professionals who bring real-world implementation experience with global companies to our projects. You might know a little bit about our team already, but just a quick overview for those who don't. We work with key stakeholders in the supply chain process to help identify crucial business needs, strategy, and focus. We combine strategy, process, people, and technology to design an integrated process to give your organization the right answers to the right questions at the right time. And we take that defined business process and help you select the appropriate technology solution to be utilized and implemented. Our presenters today are two of SCM Connections' founding partners and solution architects, Sanjay Jalaji and Patrick Green. Both Sanjay and Patrick have over 14 years of SAP implementation experience and over 10 years working in supply chain and advanced planning and optimization. Sanjay's focus is in supply chain network planning and collaboration, while Patrick is responsible for integrated supply chain design and manufacturing optimization. Before we get started, we just want to take a quick look at who is in the room. So I'm going to open a poll here. You should see that poll up on your screen. If you can take a minute and answer one of those, consultant, head of supply chain, supply planner, or other. I'll give that about 20 more seconds. Okay. Great. So you can see here, it looks like we've got a handful of consultants, and our majority are actually fit into the other category. So with that, we will get this presentation going. I'm going to turn controls over to Sanjay, and he'll take it from there.
Okay, hello everybody. This is Sanjay. Thanks a lot for joining, and we are just beginning to do some of these presentations, so you will, as we go through them, you will see, if you're on our mailing list, you'll continue to see the postings. We'll have them every maybe 2 months or 3 months. We'll vary that depending on the level of interest that people show in the different topics. So, but today's focus is going to be on shelf life planning. There has been a lot of interest in it, especially as it relates to S&P. So one of the things we want to do is just talk through. It is at a high level in the sense that there's only so much that we can do as we go through in an hour's time, but we'll try and do as much as we can. Hold on here while I try and get this organized to where we can move on to the next page. Okay. So irrespective of how I see it, I think you guys should be able to control and maximize your screens to where you can see the entire thing maxed out. But I just had to kind of minimize mine to move forward. So, and please don't hesitate to post your Q&As as we go along. But if you could just hold off your questions. If there's a specific slide number you want me to go to as we get to the end of our session, just make a note of the slide number that you want us to go to, and then we can talk through it as we get to our Q&A session at the end. So as far as an overview of what we're going to talk through today, most of you, well, I guess some of you must be familiar with some of the limitations that exist, both within S&P and PPDS in how to manage shelf life. I think the limitations exist more on the S&P side more than anything else. But what we wanted to do is take two specific case studies of real-life implementation experience that we've gone through and kind of share our specific approaches to how we manage it, both within S&P and PPDS. So for the first case study, which is what I'm going to talk through, is for a consumer packaged goods company. And as far as the process goes, this was, we were looking at utilizing shelf life within, midterm distribution planning and fulfillment processes. And as far as modules of technology that we were utilizing as a part of the planning process was, with heuristics, with the optimizer, and within deployment. And these are, the specific modules within S&P. And for the second case study, this was for a life sciences company, and, we were utilizing short-term distribution planning, and then, and this was all within PPDS. So we'll go through both case studies, but keep in mind that, what we were doing was based specifically on design that existed at both these sites, and the solutions that we put in place were limited by what existed and how we adapted to the existing environment, especially in the way they were utilizing things in ECC. We had to limit ourselves to what existed over there because the shelf life planning functionality was introduced at a later point in time when both, both ECC and APO were already live and there were business users in the system already. So, so let's talk through, I guess at a basic level, why consider shelf life. And, there are some pretty obvious reasons, but at the same time, one of the things we've noticed in the industry, well, in several industries, is that companies implement and utilize controls in managing shelf life, either at the execution level or through some sort of a report that they use to actually control, what gets shipped up. Now, from an execution standpoint, there definitely are processes in place, right? So legally and otherwise, there's no way that product is going to get shipped out that is expired. So there are tight controls over there in terms of getting product out into the distribution network or to a customer without product, with product that has expired. However, from a planning standpoint, you do want to make sure that obviously you try and minimize the wastage that could potentially occur, and potentially what you want to do is try and get product out to the customer if you can sooner, depending on what some of the minimum shelf life requirements are. So I will talk a little more through this example and in terms of the behavior when you ignore shelf life or, when you consider shelf life and the implications from a planning standpoint. So if you take this example up on top, you'll see, I guess, what we can consider key figures. And these are just, this is just a simple example. Obviously there are several complexities around what a distribution network could look like and how you want to leverage it. But at a simplistic level, so you've got forecasts, you've got what I'm calling short-dated demand, and I'll talk through short-dated demand and what it meant for this first case study. But just ignore it for now as I talk through it, but I'll talk to it when we actually consider shelf life. So you've got your projected stock on hand over here, you've got expiring quantities over here, which could be in the form of either inventory, or it could be just of any kind of planned receipts that could be expiring as well. So a simple distribution network in terms of, you've got a manufacturing plant and you've got a distribution center, and you've got a distribution demand over here that's coming off of any supply being generated over here, right? So the supply over here results in distribution demand at the manufacturing plant, and then you've got a projected stock on hand over here, and you potentially could have some inventory over here as well, which is expiring, right? So in this example, if you look at the distribution center, you'll see that 500 is expiring over here. So you can meet this demand of 400 across up to this bucket of week 4 over here, but technically you cannot meet this demand over here because the inventory that exists of 500 is expiring over here. So if you were ignoring shelf life, right, essentially you would consider that you still have 100 available over here, so you aren't going to generate any supply over here, but over here where you've used up all of your 500, you will generate additional supply, right? And in this example over here, even though you've got inventory, this inventory is expired over here, but because we aren't considering shelf life as a part of the planning process, I'm not going to generate any additional supply over here because I'm going to see this as available inventory. So, so in that sense, what we're doing is we're taking inventory that exists and seeing it as available, and then in turn not generating the additional supply that's needed. So now when you come down over here, and we say that, well, we do want to consider shelf life as a part of our planning process, then because of this expiring quantity over here, one of the ways that you can do this, and I'll talk through this a little more as we look at some of the standard S&P key figures, you'll see that what we want to do is we want to take whatever is unfulfilled. So in terms of, you've got this 500 over here of inventory, and you've got 400 demand. So essentially, there is a quantity of 100 that's going to get wasted because you're not going to be able to utilize that. So there's a process that we can utilize where we take whatever is considered wastage, and we generate demand to kind of offset this inventory, remaining inventory that is expiring. So what we can do is take this 100, generate the demand, and now that's a part of total demand. So because you've got this additional demand that's being generated over here, the system should generate an additional supply of 100 over here to meet this forecast, and then also an additional supply of 100 to meet this forecast, right? And similarly, if you take it down to the manufacturing plant, because this inventory is expired, we want to generate additional demand to offset this expired inventory, so that the system will generate the additional supply that is needed because of that expired inventory. Right, so this is just a simplistic example, and we'll talk through this a little more in terms of how it's looked at within S&P, right? Not only in terms of the standard S&P key figures that are available, but also in terms of what I'm calling as this special key figure, which is this short-dated demand. So, so I guess you can also, in terms of, some of the benefits, right? So you're preventing wastage, right? And so that's a big thing. You're providing visibility to true inventory that's available, and not just, your standard inventory that's coming over without any kind of expiration dates. And then, you're kind of what you're doing in terms, and this was kind of a big benefit for the first case study where we implemented was, even though there's a tracking mechanism that's happening at the back end at an execution level where we are preventing product from getting shipped out, what we were doing is, we were preventing by managing it at planning level. What we're doing is preventing this incidence of where product would exist as available inventory, but it's only when they go around to pick product, for shipping is when they find out, oh, well, this inventory is not available, right? So by being proactive about it, from a deployment standpoint, what we were doing is preventing the creation of deployment orders that would actually be executable, right? So normal process, if we have this visibility within S&P, then we can prevent this deployment from happening and prevent the creation of these orders, which in turn, from an execution standpoint, will lead to additional work in the sense that, somebody is actually going to look at that. One is, that order is created. The second thing that's happening is somebody's actually going to go out and try and pick and then find out that, oh, well, this inventory really has expired. So we were preventing the additional work from happening as you get down to an execution level. And I'll talk about that some more as we get down to, the deployment slides. So, so let's move on, talk through, well, okay, we're going to try and do a poll now. So just answer this as quickly as you can.
So let's see here for a little bit more context. Got another quick poll here to look at when will you be implementing shelf life planning as a part of your supply planning process? Go ahead and choose one of those answers. A, in the next 6 months, B, in the next year, C, in the next 1 to 5 years, and D, in other. Go ahead and answer those if we can. We'll give that another couple of seconds here, get some more answers in. Okay, in about 5 more seconds. 2, great. So if you can see here, it looks like we've got a couple of plans to implement in the next 6 months, then the next year, and then the majority are planning on some other time frame. So turn it back over to Sanjay.
Okay, so just to talk through the case study a little bit more, so again, consumer packaged goods, wanted to consider shelf life as a part of distribution, as a part of production, and as a part of deployment processes. One of the unique things, and here's where I'll talk to this a little more, and it'll become a little more clearer as I talk through some of the master data, but was as a part of their processes in the way they were handling things, not only from an execution standpoint, but also from a planning standpoint, is that they use this concept of what they call a short-dated date. And the short-dated date is nothing more than a few months, and it can vary across product lines, but a few months before the product is actually set to expire, they would take it out of the distribution network. So from a planning standpoint, they really always plan to this date rather than the expiration date. And you could almost equate this to the concept of what SAP treats as a minimum shelf life. So we talked through the options of utilizing, the minimum shelf life and having maybe both the true expiration date as well as the minimum shelf life, and having both available in the system. But they made a conscious decision not to utilize that because they felt that from a process standpoint, they really didn't care about the true expiration date at all. They were using processes in ECC to take this inventory out of circulation a few months. Generally, it could vary from anywhere from 3 to 6 months, actually, where they would take it out of circulation. So what that meant was that from an execution standpoint, they would take this inventory and not even make it, it's not even available, from an ADP standpoint. So they would move it to a separate storage location. And from a planning standpoint, we would actually take that inventory. We take that inventory and we don't even bring it into APO to where it's not considered for planning. So there are many different ways in which you can manage this, I think, and as you go through your implementations, I think you'll have to decide how you want to go about this. But I'll talk through how we did it, and then, you can maybe at the end clarify with any questions that you might have on why we did it this way. So, so as a part of, and I'll talk through this some more as we get to it in terms of, how we handle the master data for this. We also made a conscious decision to make shelf life product specific, because for one of these divisions that we implemented, there wasn't anything that was unique to where, for a specific location, they wanted it to be different from another location. So, this was all US based. So there wasn't any specific requirement where they wanted to say, across countries, they could have, the same product could potentially have different shelf lives. We wanted to make sure that, if we were going to generate additional demand to kind of offset this expiring inventory, then safety stock should consider this additional demand that's being generated as a part of total demand. So safety stock should factor in this additional demand. And then this expiration data, we wanted to make sure it's visible in the planning books. And then we wanted to also make it available in additional reports. Okay, so over here, this kind of just talks through, what was the master data that was integrated, that's one. And the other was what we were doing different in terms of, what we were adjusting as we brought this master data over. So one of the things that is kind of unique, well, it might not be unique, I think we see it in more and more now, is this specific company has a strong master data team, and a lot of the master data was actually being maintained in APO. And they made a conscious decision not to maintain shelf life data in ECC. So, you can see over here that I'm talking through, I'm kind of showing that total shelf life and minimum shelf life being maintained in ECC, but we weren't really bringing it over into APO. We were maintaining the shelf life directly in APO. And now, this is just as it relates to master data. So we were maintaining the shelf life, the minimum shelf life, and the maximum shelf life directly in APO. We were, and one of the prerequisites, in order to get this data over, both from a requirement and from a stock perspective, is to have, specific batch classes and characteristics that need to be maintained in ECC. And those we were bringing over as, master data. So obviously batch management is a prerequisite, and then having a batch class associated with the product is a prerequisite. So so that's one of the things you'll have to do, is make sure you create a class and assign that to your products so that you want to plan an APO that need to consider shelf life. Here I'm talking about, okay, there's a specific batch classification itself, and the fact that you've got to bring the classification over as it relates to, in the way that it comes over from ECC. So just to kind of, it does get confusing, but keep in mind that you need the class and the characteristic as master data that needs to come over, and then you need the batch, the specific batch and the associated classification to come over as well, right? So, and when I'm talking about that over here, I'm talking about the specific inventory and the batch associated with that inventory, bringing that over. So you've got, legacy, you've got ECC, you've got APO over here, right? So we were just bringing, the good thing about what we were doing is, however you're capturing that data, whether it's directly in ECC or whether you bring it over from the legacy system, you need to have the expiration date in ECC. So we were bringing that into APO, and then we were doing some remapping where we were taking that expiration date and converting that into what we were calling as the short dated date, right? So that, remember, is the date which is a few months before expiration actually happens. So I'll try to step it up a little here. I know we are going to try and cover the PPDS side of things as well, but it's important you kind of, from an S&P standpoint, understand how the integration works. So this, again, is some more detail in terms of how we brought that data over. So again, you've got your master data in ECC, you've got your master data in APO. So really not relevant for what we did from a master data standpoint, because we were maintaining this data directly in APO. Okay, so just keep in mind that, in order to turn on shelf life, obviously you need to have the planning with shelf life turned on over here. You need to maintain a shelf life, which is what we were doing, and then we were maintaining a maximum shelf life. So so what we were doing was, if this was the true expiration date, we were using the shelf life over here to represent what was this short dated period, right? So this is kind of the period where we wanted to treat as shelf life in APO, where we were saying that, as far as APO is concerned, product expires over here after 540 days. Even though from an execution and true expiration standpoint, it's 720 days, from an APO planning perspective, we were treating this as the expiration date. So this talks a little bit about the class and the characteristics associated with the class that are needed for shelf life. And again, these are all standard SAP characteristics. You will need to create a class and assign it to the product or the material in ECC, but you do need to get this class and the associated characteristics over into APO. So there are several things to consider, and there are OSS notes associated with the integration of classes and characteristics. Just keep those in mind and look those up before you do the integration, because there are several things that you need to factor in about, what specific characteristics you bring over, and there are recommendations from SAP about what not to bring over. So look out for those notes. I don't have the notes listed here, but if you send me an email, I can refer you to those notes. Okay, now as far as the specific batches themselves go, right? So if you look at the batch master in ECC, we had several combinations, right? At a minimum, what we wanted to make sure always was that the batches as they existed in ECC at least had an expiration date. But we always had combinations of some cases where manufacturing date did exist, in other cases it did not exist. But we always wanted to make sure that the expiration date itself always existed. So one of the things, like we were saying, when we brought the batch over into APO, what we were doing is we were subtracting what we were calling as this holding period, and then offsetting and making the expiration date to be a few months before it actually expired, so that was actually the true expiration date. Okay, so the shelf life key figures, right? So SAP provides these standard key figures for you. So expiring quantity, projected wastage quantity, stock on hand shelf life, and supply shortage shelf life. So there's a standard S&P planning book that has these key figures. So, if you've got your own planning book, you'll have to, and data view, you'll have to pull them in. And what SAP does is essentially utilizes dynamic pegging to determine what the wastage quantity is going to be. But it uses the expiring quantity refers to any supply, whether it's inventory or whether it's a planned order, whether it's a distribution receipt plan, all of those will show up as expiring based on the expiration date that is calculated. So, in this example, I've got this 500 as inventory, right? And that inventory is expiring right away over here in this week. So, and this is based on the batch that are brought over from ECC with that specific expiration date. So again, it's expiring quantity that's true. We could refer to inventory or any kind of supply. So just to kind of quickly talk through how it's calculating this wastage over here. So you've got, your forecast over here. You've got a forecast over here of 300 and 100, and in this inventory of 500 again, going back to the earlier example that I was showing you, you've got a wastage over here of 100. So in essence, this forecast over here cannot be met with the remaining supply that's available over here. So this is what standard S&P behavior you'll see. So here, I'm not showing you the short-dated demand that I showed you earlier, but I'll talk through that over here. So without actually having this additional key figure and copying the wastage quantity from here into here, you aren't going to factor in expiring inventory within S&P. So what you've got to do, and this is what SAP really doesn't provide to you, is the ability to then take whatever is considered as wastage and offset that. So this is the additional key figure that we created to kind of, manage and the expiring quantity. And again, this wastage quantity is being determined based on dynamic pegging. So now that you've got this offset, you still kind of see the shortage of 100 and 200. If I go back to the earlier slide, you'll see that you really weren't seeing a shortage because of the fact that we didn't have this offset of demand that was being generated. But now that you have it over here, you kind of see the wastage over here. So through macros and additional key figures, you need to adjust your macros to also include the short-dated demand as a part of your total demand. So that as you run heuristics, it will be considered as a part of your planning process. So, and again, if you need help with macros, expired inventory. So part of the way deployment was handled at this one customer was that they would only deploy against inventory, right? So they wouldn't plan any kind of deployment against, let's say, quality stock or inventory that's, or planned receipts or production orders or process orders. So what they were doing was essentially only against inventory. So one of the requirements was to take any inventory that's going to expire within a certain horizon and not consider that as deployable inventory. So in this example, I've got inventory that is expired, that's non-deployable. I've got inventory within this horizon that is not deployable. But then I've got other inventory that expires after the deployment horizon, and that's available for deployment. So in essence, what we were doing was taking inventory that is about to expire and then preventing confirmations from occurring because of that deployment. So these are kind of, in a very simplistic way is the way we kind of handled and considered shelf life planning as a part of S&P. There are several considerations as you move to the optimizer and then heuristics. It works a lot easier with heuristics. There are several things to consider when you do it as a part of the optimizer. And, we can talk to that maybe later in another session that we have, but for now, we just wanted to give you guys a general idea about how it works within S&P. There are shelf life standard S&P shelf life alerts that are available that you can activate that talks about the shortage from a shelf life perspective and the wastage quantity. So these alerts are standard. So without doing anything at all, you could generate these alerts and have those, utilize those from a planning perspective. Okay. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Pat and Megan. I'm not sure if you want to do another poll here.
Okay. Can you hear me, Sanjay, everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'd like to just, number one, Patrick, my name is Patrick Green. I'm one of the principals here at SCM Connections, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining our call. This is an opportunity for us to kind of give back to the community and give back some of our lessons learned as part of this webinar series and kind of share with individuals, not only, people we work with and clients, et cetera, some of our experiences and how to make our supply chain better, some of the things that we've done. Hopefully you'll find it educational and if not entertaining, but we do appreciate your time and your taking up the time today to listen. I'm going to go through today shelf life planning and PPDS, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So we've got, it's about 1:40, doing a time check. I'm going to try and slide through these fairly quickly. So if I go too fast, please don't, feel free to have any follow-up questions or contact me directly. We'll have all of our information published after. Shelf life planning in PPDS is a little bit different than it is in S&P in terms of the fact that now we're in a time continuous order-based relationship between two orders, right? And shelf life is essentially it is a further characteristic of much like S&P, it's a characteristic of either the receipt or the inventory or the requirement. So what SAP does is in PPDS, it kind of pegs everything based on this shelf life window, okay? So the case study we're going to go through today is for some work we did at a pharmaceutical company, and they were using PPDS Heuristics for their distribution planning for short to mid range. Distribution planning, because some of the requirements that distribution planning had to take into consideration what they called expiry date or shelf life date for the batch for each finished good, not only from a stock perspective, but also any planned inventory obsolescence that may happen because of lot sizing or some fixed lot sizing parameters that they have. They wanted to understand if they made too much and it was short dated or expired before they were able to consume it all, they wanted to be able to plan for additional receipts, okay? The other thing is they wanted shelf life at all nodes in the distribution chain, and the next slide I'll go through kind of illustrates that. If they had a long distribution chain, that was one of the things in pharmaceuticals is when you ship something for manufacturing and it goes from node to node within the distribution chain, you have quality inspection steps. So the transportation time may be somewhat limited, 1 week or 2 weeks, et cetera, but your actual, by the time you can actually ship that out to the next node in the supply chain, that may be a 30-day hold or a 15-day hold to make sure that all the pharmaceutical assays and tests are completed before it goes on to the next, it can be distributed out. So what it does, it adds a lot of time to the supply chain. So, and you'll see that in the next slide, but what we attempted to do in the PPDS side was to then consume or make sure that we're getting our end customer has enough expiry or shelf life by the time it gets to the end customer. So the end customer date is really what drives the expiry date, not necessarily the expiry date of node to node in the supply chain. The only other thing I say, we did use PPDS Heuristics for DRP planning, which is a little bit different than most companies would use S&P. This particular client was using, company was using PPDS pretty much across the board for all of their short to midterm distribution planning in this particular instance. Okay, so if you look at the problem statement, total lead time which is fairly typical if you're manufacturing something in the US and it's going to Europe or Asia or Africa, the distribution time can be very long. So if you can take the example, by the time it goes from the plant to a hub, distribution hub is 20 days. And then it's going to go through assays, et cetera, and by the time it goes from distribution from the US into a distribution center, from the hub in the US to a distribution center in, say, Europe, it's going to go through customs, it's going to be received, it's going to have to go through a quality inspection step, and it's not available to the customer for another 30 days. So if you take all of that within the supply chain, you're looking at a lead time of 110 days. So if you consider the fact that maybe a product has 180 days of shelf life, or say 365 days, you're consuming 110 just getting it through the distribution network. So the customer gets the receipt with, if it's 365 days, with 200 and some days of shelf life remaining, okay? Any disruption in that supply chain, and you can have an issue where all of a sudden, if they require 90 days of remaining shelf life, now you don't have enough inventory, or they're not going to accept the inventory and you're shorting the customer, okay? Within the pharmaceutical network, or pharmaceutical companies, and kind of the slogan there typically is don't run out, don't ever run out. Inventory is notoriously cheap, so the cost of carrying the inventory is a far greater, far less than actual delivery or a missed delivery for a patient. So they don't really mind the inventory as much as they do making sure that they have it available for the customer at every point in the chain, okay? So within PPDS, we have a couple of things. It's similar to S&P in terms of the setup. The batch data in ECC is driven off the shelf life expiry date as well as the available from date. And it's kind of a key concept because the available from date says when that batch will be available, okay? And then the shelf life expiry date says when that batch will actually expire from the definition of expiry at for the client or the company. So that may be, it only has 30 days of shelf life left, and we pull it off the shelf 60 days ahead of time. But that definition says this is when we're taking it out of inventory, okay? So that date on the batch integrates with APO as the required maximum shelf life date, okay? So what that means is that that date is when it's going to actually expire. So these slides are a little bit dated, but you'll see that that's the date that will be used for planning within the heuristic. So the heuristic will say, oh, if that inventory is not available, if I have a requirement that's after 6/30/2013, even though I have stock available, I can't use that for my customer. Okay. The other thing that we did at this client was we had a location-dependent shelf life. So from location to location, that shelf life could have differed. So what it did is it allowed them to kind of differentiate between different layers in the supply chain, different nodes, which then allowed them to say, okay, well, I need 120 days at my distribution center, but maybe I need 180 days at my manufacturing site. And then that kind of let them classify and kind of strategize in terms of having a little bit more detail around what their dates were, okay? So I'll go to next. Next slide kind of shows when shelf life is activated, the batch characteristics, and all of that is tied to the batch, come over to APO, and the demands now carry a minimum required shelf life date, okay? So now if you have a forecast, and it says, okay, my forecast is on 12/12/2013, and I need 90 days of shelf life for that forecast. I can't sell it to the customer with anything less than 90 days, okay? What it does, it creates a minimum shelf life on that forecast. So then it compares the shelf life of the inventory or the receipt that's being the incoming receipt, manufacturing or distribution, and compares that to the expected expiry date of that receipt, okay? So now one of the things you'll kind of see with most companies is they have defining what the shelf life is probably not as clear-cut as you would think. Maybe it's the next expiry date. Maybe it's the shelf life. Maybe it's when we pull it from the shelf, but it doesn't actually expire until 6 months later. So one of the things that we've seen at clients is that they don't have a clear definition of it, and we've had to enhance the SIP to get the right date based on the most conservative date of whether it's the next inspection date or whether it's the shelf life date or manufacturing date plus 180 days, whatever it might be. I would expect that your clients that you would kind of see the same thing, just because we tend not to see a clear definition of what that looks like, and there tend to be vagaries within each individual client of how to calculate that, okay? So if you look at this, we're saying here, we need a date that cannot expire for this forecast before 3/12/14. And that is when the minimum date, if you look at that compared to the stock, the expiry date of the stock is 6/30/2013. So that stock, even though it's in inventory, is not available to fulfill that forecast based on the shelf life heuristic. All right? All right. I'm going to go through this quickly because I want to get some questions in. What the shelf life heuristic does is it then takes that into consideration when planning, okay? And so it doesn't consider the shelf because the stock, because that's going to expire before my requirements date. And it creates another purchase rec or incoming receipt to fulfill that forecast requirement, okay? Now, if you look at the available quantity will say, I still have 1,000 in inventory and I'm making more, so that doesn't change, but I can't use it for this particular forecast, okay? So that's great. You've got a purchase rec that now has a requirement state associated with it. As you move through the network, the requirement date needs to propagate throughout the network because, again, we want to have the shelf life date not necessarily of the lowest node in the supply chain, i.e. manufacturing. We really want to know that what the requirement date is for the customer. Okay? So how that propagates through is a propagation heuristic which calculates or propagates the minimum shelf life date from the demand element to the purchase rec. Okay? It's a separate heuristic that has to be executed. And as an aside, when we go through and you plan node to node, you really cannot do a network heuristic via shelf life. You have to do it node by node by node. Otherwise, you'll get inconsistent results if you don't propagate after planning each node. So that ends up being a bit of a kind of watch out from a technical perspective. But after running the heuristic, what you'll see is the demand, the forecast requirement for the demand now gives me the required maximum shelf life date or the purchase rec, okay? That's for both sides. So now when I look at the demand at the lower level, at the next level, this is the distribution center, when I look at the demand for the hub, that purchase rec has a requirement of 3/12/14. So when I do the calculation of heuristic net requirements at the hub, it'll take that date into consideration when planning, okay? And it's kind of a key concept because it doesn't happen automatically. It has to be propagated throughout the supply chain for the nodes. Okay? So here's kind of if you look at this, we've got two locations. We've got 461, which was the distribution center, and I'm sorry, that's the hub, and C301, which is the actual distribution center. And if you look here, it's kind of small, you might not be able to see it, but the arrow, the little red arrow is pointing to the 3/12/14. And if I look at the PREC-REL at the at the hub, you're going to see that now my requirement shelf life date at the hub is going to be 3/12/14. And then that gets considered in the heuristic for PPDS as you move down the supply chain. So it'll say, okay, do I have stock that meets that requirement? Yes or no, and if I don't, or a receipt, and then if not, plan to make more based on that, okay? Here's the last slide I have. You know, this is really kind of as we went through some of the lessons learned and issues we have with the PPDS, running shelf life heuristic and PPDS. It works well in terms of the overall heuristic, but there are some concerns and some watch-outs. One, you need to understand your lead times and your lot sizes. You may be planning, your client may be planning in a way that always creates additional inventory, right? So they have a lot size, let's say we always plan in 10,000, but we only consume in that period that is enough to fulfill 6 months worth of demand. Well, if you have a 3-month shelf life date, you're always running out of shelf life before you consume that demand and throw inventory away. So really you need to understand that, as well as what are the lead times in your supply chain. So if your lead times are wrong, you may be planning, if they're too long, you may be planning for inventory to make additional inventory that you don't need, right? Because you will have enough supply to fulfill it. Or if they're too short, you may be planning, the other way around. If they're too long, you may be under planning, and if they're too short, you may be over planning. So you need to understand that and how it kind of fits in with your the whole process, because if you get that right, if it's not aligned, you're going to have issues where you're under or over planning. So the other thing is the propagation. And as you move demands around, as that propagation rolls through each node, the propagation takes the most conservative date. So the minimum required shelf life date. As your demands peg to it, that can cause an issue where you have a demand that is no longer being fulfilled by a minimum shelf life because it's been assigned with propagation. So what we did at this client is we cleared the propagation, made sure we had everything cleared on a propagation, all of our shelf life dates were set to the standard, planned, and then repropagated. And what it did is that all of those demands would then get aligned to the supply element because it's based on pegging relationships, okay? You can get erroneous plan, and kind of getting into details, I won't get into them here, but it really can cause an issue, especially something kind of a demand flows outside of the pegging window that's been built for shelf life pegging. Okay. And then the last thing that's kind of a watch out is understanding the planning sequence, because as the propagation rolls through down the supply chain, it's really understanding that the customer drives demand to the distribution center, which drives demand to the hub, which drives demand to the manufacturing site. If you have a recursive or a buy receipt, a supply buy type relationship in your node, you need to define those in a way that they plan sequentially. You tend to get hiccups if you don't do that in a sequential manner. You'll have something that's being planned. It's really low-level code generation. You'll have something that's planned in one location but it's being received in another, and the shelf life requirements end up getting inconsistent. Okay. And I think that's all I have. I don't know, Megan, are you online now? Or Sanjay? I think we're going to open it up to questions.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, we got that. So I think what we're going to do is skip this poll just due to the time frame. I know people, it's Friday, so we'll try and answer all the questions we've got so far. If you have additional questions, please go ahead and feel free to type them in over here. But so one of the first questions is how is the and for the benefit of all, right? So the first question was, how is the expiry stock removed from ATD, available to deploy? And the answer to that really is, we thought we would have to do some sort of a development for it, but we actually were able to do it through a macro. So it was a fairly simple macro, but it was because of the way we were using it only with inventory, we were able to modify the available to deploy through using the macro. The second question was in the shelf life planning books, why is it required to have a custom key figure and to adjust the wastage? So we thought about that as well. I mean, so potentially you could just use the wastage quantity and add that up to the total demand. But the reason we went with a custom key figure was essentially because we wanted to for one, we didn't want to touch the standard SAP key figure in any way. And the other reason was we wanted another custom key figure to kind of control what we were doing with it for the S&P optimizer. And there are several things to consider when you get around to utilizing a key figure for the optimization. Not only in terms of how you're going to use it, interactively, but also how you're going to use it in batch mode, and at what point in time do you actually want to calculate the short-dated demand. So that's part of the reason why we ended up using a custom key figure. Okay, Pat, I'll let you answer the other question, so which was, how does propagation handle the two demand with different shelf life pegged to one receipt?
Yeah, so what it does, it takes the most conservative of the two. So if you have two demands for a single receipt, and the demand will be the most conservative, so which would then provide enough for both receipts, right? So if you have shelf life that the one requirement is on July 15th and the second demand was on August 15th, it would use the August 15th as the receipt required date. So what can happen is now your receipt will, you sometimes get two receipts coming out of a heuristic because maybe you have a fixed receipt at that point. It meets one requirement and not the next. So when you plan the next time, it'll plan to the second. But the propagation will be the most conservative of the two. Okay. And Sanjay, I think that's it for time.
Yeah.
What we'll do is let's take the questions we have, and we'll send out a summary of the question and put some details around them.
Okay.
Okay.
So thanks everyone for attending. We've got some upcoming webinars. Don't miss out on those. Early registration is happening now. We've got forecast consumption, where forecast meets reality, at the end of July, and then the SIF, key understandings from implementation to troubleshooting, at the end of September, and we will be pushing out a lot more content between now and then. So definitely keep an eye on our website, and definitely stay connected. We are on LinkedIn. We've got great blogs, Google+, Twitter, and Facebook. And as always, send us an email if you have any further questions. Thanks again for attending, everyone.
Yeah, before we hang up, I just wanted to say if we have any, if you have any suggestions for topics or you know, future webcastings you'd like to get some information on, feel free to reach out to us and get some feedback. You know, we're starting down this path. We plan to do this consistently every other month or potentially more often. So, like I say, we're trying to build a community around this to share ideas and share our experiences and give back. So, you know, we're more than happy to take your feedback and your input. So anything is absolutely appreciated.
And we will get back to you on those questions that you had. So just stay tuned on that. So we do have your email, so we will get back to you on that.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.